Great to be here. Thanks for coming out tonight. And thanks to Dr. Ken Funk for bringing me out and for knocking on ICR's door year after year. When are you going to send someone from Dallas? Not this year. And he kept knocking. So patience, perseverance, persistence. I wish we had more like you. So that's great. What I came to share tonight is some of the reasons why I went from evolution to creation. So I used to believe in evolution, and I would have lined up with this BioLogos group that you just talked about with the Templeton and all the, because I thought that science proved evolution. I thought it was scientific, because it's all I had ever been told. So when I learned that, wait, there's something else out there, there's other information that my professors didn't say anything about, there's what I have not been told about fossils. So when I started learning that, then boy, my life started to change. My life started to change, not just academically. It went from academics, well, there's new facts, there's new fossil features that I wasn't told about, to, wait a minute, these fossil features fit the Bible. And if the Bible's true about the history of the world, then it's true about whatever it says. So then my walk with God changed, and my view of who God is ultimately changed. And I wanted that for everyone. And I wanted to see Christians expand their view of who this God is, who we say we worship. So anyway, so that's kind of what I'm all about tonight. It started, for me, I had faith in evolution, and a friend of mine helped plant a seed of doubt in my strong faith in evolution. And it came about in this way. We were, I was being discipled, and so I knew the Lord, but I also believed in evolution. So it was that kind of thing. And he said, let's go learn how to witness. So he took me out witnessing, and he was having this conversation with a gal on the street, and we were out in front of we're on the street in front of a bar, and a guy walks out of the bar, and I mean, he is capital D drunk. And he says, "You're talking about the Bible? The Bible's a bunch of junk, man." And I thought, oh boy, here come the sparks. They're about to fly. And so my friend Kurt, who's just a lowly history major, therefore shouldn't know anything about anything. And I was a biology major, so he had better answers than I did. And so he talked to this drunk guy, and I thought, oh, the drunk guy's making good points. But my friend's name is Kurt, K-U-R-T. I have to spell it because I said Kurt the other day, and someone said, was it Kirk Cameron, the actor? Different guy. Kurt. So what convinced you of that? You're the one that said the Bible's a bunch of junk. What convinced you of that? And I think that's a magic question. And then Kurt asked me a similar question later on. You believe in evolution, Brian? I sure do. What convinced you of that? What science convinced you of that? And so he's asking me these kinds of questions. What experiment convinced you of evolution? There isn't one, you know. But until we ask our friends and neighbors and family members this question, they're not going to be, you know, it might not start the gears turning. So that was the seed of doubt planted in my faith in evolution. Started with this conversation on the street, and the guy said, "Bible's a bunch of junk. What convinced you of that? Fossils. Fossils are millions of years old, and there's no millions of years in the Bible." And I thought, oh, the guy has a point. Fossils are millions of years old, and it's not in the Bible. What am I doing witnessing? I'm supposed to be representing this Bible, but my witness was weak because I didn't have confidence that Genesis got it right. I knew parts of the Bible were right, the parts that talked about my soul and how I had sin and I needed a Savior, but there's way more to God than that as I began to learn. Did you know, says Kurt, that they date the fossils based on the rocks, and they date the rocks based on the fossils that are in it? And did you know that that's circular reasoning? And the guy goes, "What are you talking about, man?" And waved his hand, turned around, walked off. Never seen him since. And that was in, we call it Nacogdoches. Just say NAC for short. That's how we pronounce that. So Nacogdoches, Texas. And so later on, Kurt said, what do you think of that conversation, Brian? And I said, wow, I've never heard that, circular reasoning, that they date the fossils based on the rock and the rock based on the fossils. He said, can you disprove that? Do they actually use real science to assign ages to fossils? What science do they use? And I couldn't find an answer for Kurt. I wanted to say, here's the science they use. They measure age using this device. And now I look back on those days and I think, how are you going to measure, what units are you going to use? Agicals? You can't measure age. You can measure isotope ratios, but you have to convert those into an age using a formula that has assumptions built in. But I didn't know that back then because I was just a lowly biology major. And so this is what happened. And so he challenged me, and he said, he challenged me 6 times. Once a week, he would bring it up again. And I said, Kurt, I'm tired of you asking me about circular reasoning, okay? I can't refute it, all right? Don't ask me about it. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm a grumpy little teenager. Meh. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll stop bothering you if you'll read a creation book. Creation book? That's quack science, man. Are you kidding me? Light bulb. I'll read the book and refute it. He'll stop bothering me, and I'll show him how dumb he is because he's not a biology major. So I got one of those yellow pads with the pages that flip over, a legal pad, and pen in hand, and I got the book the creation book, and it was written by some dummy named Dr. Henry Morris from the Institute for Creation Research. This guy doesn't know anything, And I read page 1, and I was like, well, that actually kind of makes some sense. Page 2, this makes a good point. Chapter 2, no one told me this. And we got to the fossil chapter, I thought, no one told me any of this. And he's quoting from evolutionists. He's not making this stuff up. He's quoting from the same kinds of people who are my professors at this university, pounding it into my head that you have to believe in evolution. And I thought, I have been led down the wrong path. I wish I was told what's in this book. And so I can just see God up in heaven looking down at me, reading this book, going, I've got plans for you. Because now I work at the same Institute for Creation Research that produced that book so many years ago. And we have a modern version of it, which we actually brought a few copies of it tonight, Creation Basics and Beyond. So that's how it got started for me, and that's why I want to see folks really put the Bible and biblical history, elevate that. And the flood, did it really happen? Did creation really happen? Peter said in 2 Peter 3, scoffers will come in the last days. And what are they going to scoff at? And he literally says, for they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were made and the earth. So they willfully forget about creation and that the earth that then was perished being flooded by water. So they willfully forget creation and the flood. And what do my professors do? They willfully forget. So that means being dumb on purpose, creation and the flood. And so I want to get back to saying, wait a minute, we can't just dismiss the flood so easily, especially considering the 3 flood-friendly fossil features. I alliterated that on purpose. Thank you very much. Flood-friendly fossil features, 3 of them that I want to present tonight. The first is burial. So here we are. This is a dig we did in Montana, Hell Creek Formation, famous for a particular fossil named B. rex. I'm going to tell you a little bit about B. rex in about half an hour. So here's me holding my dinosaur fossil that I found, and it's still sitting in my refrigerator at the Institute. We have 50 employees in Dallas, 3 buildings, including a brand new, beautiful Discovery Center. It's like a museum. Kids bring their families in. Have you been? You got your thumbs up. Oh, yeah. Yeah, great. So good. And then so anyway, that's a little bit about the Institute. We try to do research because it's the Institute for Creation Research. We're trying to get answers to some questions. On the left bottom, you see a chunk of something that's not like the sandstone that's around it. By the way, the sandstone in this rock formation that covers all of Montana, and it continues covering all of Wyoming, but over there it has a different name because a different geologist named it at a different time. But it's the same sandstone, same kind of fossils in it, and it covers half the western United States. It's just absolutely vast. That is a chunk of a soft-shell turtle carapace. Okay, so that's what that is. You can see the little bitty divots from the turtle. And then on the top left, you see a hard-shell turtle leg bone. And then on the top, you see a scute. You know what a scute is? Alligator scute? Yeah, so it's part of their scales. It's like a piece of bone embedded in their skin. And that's what these alligators have. And then on the bottom right, a fig, fossilized fig. Now, have you ever heard of a soft-shelled turtle, hard-shelled turtle, an alligator, and a fig? So these are what we call living fossils, because they look exactly the same in the fossils as they do today on Earth. But they're buried right in that same exact layer that has dinosaur bone fragments, and in some cases, whole bones, and in some cases, very rarely, most of a carcass. Wow. I'd like to discover that someday. So the first flood-friendly feature that we find in our fossil digs is that we have living fossils. What do you see buried in these burials? First, it's burial. We're talking about burial. We're seeing today's creatures that look just like today's creatures, some of them. Shark teeth, clams, just like today, buried right alongside these dinosaur fossils. So the way they were buried. And here's another flood-friendly feature. Guess what museum I'm in? Say it out loud. Field Museum. This is back when Sue, probably the world's most famous dinosaur of all time ever, maybe, nicknamed Sue after the discoverer, Sue Hendrickson, on display. This is back when it was on the ground floor. I've heard they've moved it since then. Very impressive, very huge, very huge. I mean, you look at this thing and it takes half an hour to walk from nose to tail, it seems like. 45 feet long, and this thing would have weighed almost 7 tons. I mean, it's a walking biological bulldozer back when it was alive. He could go wherever he wanted. And yet something buried him. He's packed in sediment, so the sediment must have been moving faster than he could walk or swim. Otherwise, he would walk or swim away, but he couldn't get away. So something about this burial, it mixed modern-looking creatures with those creatures, and it moved across whole states, and it was moving so fast that these creatures couldn't get away. And it was moving with such force that even all this tonnage of animal muscle couldn't bull its way out. It got completely covered and buried deeply, and then it didn't even get scavenged. So we have catastrophic burial, is another way to put that. So on display there is the Sioux replica on the left with all the bone parts of its skull placed into life position. So it looks nice and pristine. And on the right, we have Sioux's original actual head in a big glass case so that we can worship it. I mean examine. Just look really closely at it. And all hail Sioux, the T-Rex. So now we see these two people on the other. Can you see them? Two poor people, and they're reading a sign. And so I'm taking my picture, and I'm thinking, I want to see the sign that they're reading. And I'm looking at the differences between the Sioux that's on display here and the Sioux the real Sioux. And so what are some of the differences? Well, we see that the top of the head is mushed down, and we see right here it's got a perfectly formed nose. But their actual Sioux has a broken nose right here. And so the sign said this. Now, warning, these people are reading this sign with straight faces. And I don't know how they're doing it, because this is what the sign says. Crushed nose. When Sue was found, her pelvis was resting on top of her snout. Not just her pelvis was above her snout, her pelvis was on top of her snout. In other words, the animal was upside down and folded in half. And that may sound odd. Why, yes, it does. We don't see that happening today. That's why it sounds odd. Well, discovering a theropod dinosaur in this death pose is surprisingly common. Well, that means it's even more odd. because it's happening all over the place. This pose may be caused by muscle spasms. And my first thought was, muscle spasms, I understand, that's what they usually do to me. They keep crushing my nose with my pelvis every time I have a muscle spasm. And it's a bummer. I hate it when that happens. And so I literally laughed out loud. I couldn't stop laughing in the middle of the museum, and I'm the only one laughing, and everyone else is just backing away. So what are you going to do? But this, to me, is a flood-friendly feature because big animals don't even turn into fossils at all, let alone get crushed by mud that turns these things upside down, folds them in half, and breaks their noses with their pelvises. Gorgosaurus. This is the kind of posture we find these in. It's typical. Ouch! That's what I'm thinking. This does not happen today, but it happened in the past. And you just read the sign. It's surprisingly common. So it was all over the place. You find these things in China. There's one from Europe. There's one dinosaur from China. Oh, these are fun to say. Anyway, it's a Compsognathus, if you want to say that. Okay, I'm going to make you say it. Compsognathus. That's more like it. Same thing. Anything with a long neck, any creature with a long neck, whether it's a bird, which are also buried in the same layer, or a dinosaur, anything with a long neck arched back every time. And so it's buried this way. So what are we seeing in these burials? It's not every day. What happens every day to an animal that gets buried? It doesn't get its head smashed against its pelvis like we see here, but it's typically common. Here's another one. This is fun to say. Sinusoropteryx. Well, you guys gave it an attempt. Sinusoropteryx. So it's basically Compsognathus. In fact, it's identical in anatomy to Compsognathus, which we find in European fossils. But since they found it in China, they give it a new name. And they found in this one, its tail had shifted after it got buried in mud. And so you see the scientists have, in their figure, numbered the places and positions where the tail was, 1, 2, and 3. And so what they're saying is the tail went from here to here to here as this thing is undergoing rigor mortis. And so tendons are tightening, tissues are drying out, and it's shifting. So that's fine and that's wonderful, but it's not that may be, you can call that a muscle spasm, but that's not enough to take its pelvis and smush it against its head, and it's got its neck arched back. So how did this get here? This is a turkey-sized dinosaur. Turkeys. Do turkeys turn into fossils? Let's say a turkey dies and falls into a swamp. Some of us I know can imagine that pretty easily. Turkeys are around here, and so are swamps. So what's in the bottom of a swamp? Turkey fossils? Not at all. It's mud, mud, mud. So something unique happened in the past where these creatures were covered so fast that they didn't get scavenged. They were buried so deeply that animals couldn't dig them up and eat them. And then they dried out soon enough to where they didn't completely rot, as we'll show you here in a minute. Well, how did this get buried? And how did it get locked in rock like this? Well, I'll tell you what the secularists wrote in the Journal of Ornithology in 2015. I propose, says the author, that the G-hole vertebrate, G-hole is a broad area of famous fossils in China. So it's got salamanders and frogs and creatures that look like, there's little mammals. One of them looks just like a squirrel, but they didn't call it a squirrel. They gave it a fancy new name because it's in the G-hole biota. Okay, but it's a squirrel. Anyway, which were scorched and perhaps covered by the rapidly descending hot ash and subsequently covered by flood waters. And so it's interesting to me as I read this technical literature where they keep saying the same thing about fossils in the western United States, covered by floodwaters. Fossils in China, covered by floodwaters. And it's like, there's a little flood here, and they'll admit to a little flood there, and a little flood there. And but if you read enough of these papers, you start getting the idea that there's just a lot of flooding going on everywhere. But it's the kind of flooding that doesn't happen today because even today's floods don't bury creatures like this. They don't bury turkey-sized, turkeys, let alone cows or elephants. And some of these dinosaurs were huge, but completely buried. So what was happening back then? Well, the mud there that this animal was mixed in, it's a mixture of mud and ash. There's ash remains that are part of the matrix, which is the rock that surrounds this carcass. And so we think about this event on May 18th, 1980. The north slope of Mount St. Helens popped off like a cork, and a bunch of pressure from beneath that had been building up for months finally released. And when it did so, a bunch of steam, vapor, pulverized solid rock, and just turned it into what's called a lahar, which is a fast-flowing bunch of hot mud. And it blasted the slopes to the north, and you see a photograph taken from a geologist who was not supposed to be there, but geologists will do anything for a picture. And it was the most photographed, I think, maybe until today, but at that time in 1980, it was by far and certainly the most photographed volcanic eruption ever. And then on the right, you see a photo of the blast as it reaches the guy taking the picture. And it hit a, you see these ridges? So there's a ridge here with this tree, the nearest trees. The blast is coming and hits this ridge and goes up and starts to come over his head. So he jumped into his pickup truck and he pushed his foot on that pedal on the right. What do they call that? Yeah, and he pushed it to where it wouldn't go down anymore. So yeah, as we call it in East Texas, I shoved back. So he shoved back, and he passed a station wagon with a family in it that got completely buried, and they all died. But he because he put the pedal to the metal, he got out of there. Now, what did this do? This hot ash, pulverizing rock, mixing it with, it made mud. And it turns out that it deposited what was once sky. It deposited 400 feet of new rock, or new mud. And that was 1980. Okay, 2 years later, 1982, a subsequent erosional event carved a new canyon right through that 2-year-old mud. And it left behind steep-sided walls, and it showed us that 4-minute-long blast deposited layers. So here's some of the layers that were deposited there in 1980 and revealed in 1982, and then photographed in something like 84 by my predecessors at the Institute, Dr. Steve Austin and Dr. John Morris. And they did several expeditions up into what they call the Lewitt Canyon, a brand new canyon name. And there's Lewitt Canyon, photographed in the mid-1980s. And so here's this explosion deposited these rock layers with the layering system, and they're steep-sided. They're steep-sided, which means that they're no longer mud. So how long does it take to make mud into solid rock? Well, if it's the right chemistry, not long at all. Certainly fewer than 2 years. When I was there a couple of years ago with a tour group, I was with a creation tour group, and we were overlooking the canyon and looking at where it had been carved through the Toutle River, new river basin. And at the same time I was there was a group of I guess tourists, you call them, from the official, national park. And so there was a group of 30, and they came by to overlook the same canyon. And one of the guys asked the young kid, he was probably a biology major, leading the tour, said, "How long did it take for this canyon to get carved?" And the kid, who had probably only heard and knew what he had been told from his geology professors, which say the same thing, canyons are carved pebble by pebble, grain by grain over millions of years. He looked behind him, and he looked at the guy asking an honest, good question. "Well, I don't know how long it took to carve, but I guess it was fewer than 40 years, because by then the eruption happened, the layers happened 40 years ago." But what he didn't know is that in 1982, one event in just hours carved that whole entire canyon system. So not 40 years, 1 day. Deposited in 4 minutes, carved in 1 day, less than a day. Anyway, so you don't need a lot of time, you just need a lot of water to make deposits. and to make them turn into stone. So that's this is a microscopic version of what may have happened. The Toutle River Basin is not even a mile wide? But we have these dinosaur deposits with ash mixed with mud and dinosaurs and other creatures that are still alive today. They cover hundreds and hundreds of square miles. So you need something much more than just one little itty-bitty volcano. You need a massive tear in the world to get what we see all over the place, like this one. If you want to say it out loud, it's fun. Brachylophosaurus. I got to be honest, you guys are struggling with these names. That's okay, it makes me feel like I'm a real professional. Neck arched back, body folded and crushed and smushed. Most of the time, we even see, like you saw, the dinosaur bone that I had in my hand there, the first slide I showed you, it was just a fragment of one bone. So whatever was happening with this burial was so violent that most often it would take the carcass, dismember the carcass, and it was like take the bones and mix them with all these other creatures and then put it in a giant washing machine and press, cycle, and it would just rattle them around, and then like a cement truck, it would dump that mix over 2 entire states. A cosmic cement truck, something like that, to get the scale of what we're talking about with this flood-friendly burial. Okay, maybe this will be easier to say, Tenontosaurus. That was better, guys. You're getting better already. This is on display at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman. So I went there to take a picture of what they had on display. And again with the neck arched back. And they had this placard describing what we're looking at. And here's the placard. I took a little picture of it. It says, "An agonizing death." And I thought, yes, you got it. Burial was agony for these creatures. It was not everyday normal processes. It was not slow and gradual and you can only think about what's happening today. No, we have to think about something else that happened in the past. Something that was reasonably responsible for all this agony. And then they said, well, our scientists here at the Museum of the Rockies, we're the ones who did the study on chickens and figured out that when you drown chickens, they drown with their necks arching back. And so these dinosaurs, with their necks arched back, they were also choking. And I thought, yes, you got it. Yes, you got it. And look at all the mud around this guy. He's definitely choking on all that mud, right? No, you read the fine print and it says, he was probably choking because a predatory dinosaur was clamped on his neck, choking him. You come almost all the way and then you drop it. So similarly, they have a placard called Bone Beds, Evidence of Catastrophe. So even my secular colleagues admit flood, 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 catastrophe, agony. Now these are the characteristics and features that don't happen today, but would have happened in the past if Noah's flood was real. Here's one of the more famous and stunning Tyrannosaurus rex fossils, nicknamed Black Beauty, on display, I think at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada. I haven't been there yet, I'd like to go. So these creatures buried catastrophically, necks arched back. Boy, you draw a chalk outline around this, if you're a police officer. What is cause of death? Choking. Cause of death here? Choking. Cause of death? Folding in half after choking. That kind of thing. Well, how extensive was it? How extensive was it? So we have a geologist who works with us, along with other scientists at the Institute in Dallas, and his name is Dr. Tim Clary, and he's been doing for 6 or 7 years now an extensive project, and I just want to tell you about it really quick, because it involves dinosaurs and fossils. And in his project, he's mapping the extent and the thickness of each of the major rock packages found on every continent. So the thickness and extent. No one has done this. It's a lot of work. The way he does it is he takes published records of drill cores. So they'll drill a core and they'll figure out what are the rocks beneath us here and what about there. And if they drill through 200 feet of limestone, they record it, 200 feet of limestone. Now, if it's 200 feet of limestone here, and then there's sandstone beneath that, and there's 200 feet or 250 feet of limestone here, and sandstone beneath that, they record all these. So they have isolated data points, and they plug all those into a specialized software called Rockworks, and it connects the dots between the data points where they were collected. So that's how he generates aerial maps that show the extent of these rock layers, and he adds thickness data in by making it colored. So he'll have the thicker it is, the bluer it is, and then the thinner the rocks, as they thin out in places, they get green, and then when they thin out, when they're completely gone, there's no color there at all. So that's what he did. And so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the thousands of maps that he's generated. We're even making movies out of it. We can see here, there's an outline of South America. Recognize that? And so let's look at that. And in South America, we have blue patches. Now, these are the lowest rock layers in South America. And this is the area that they cover, just the western parts. How did it get there? Now let's look at Africa. Of course, we have maps of Europe and the Middle East there, and he just finished Asia. He's about to publish. He's about to publish his data from Asia on this. Now, so this shows the lowest rocks, and they're always a sandstone. And they cover North Africa and Saudi Arabia, half of that. And so that's the lowest rock. Now, what about the uppermost rock layers? Well, there's another blanket sandstone that covers really the whole continent, and especially the margins. So here we have sediments being deposited offshore, wrapping around the entire continent of South America, and North America for that matter, and Europe he's done. And then offshore, the final one is offshore. So we have layer after layer being deposited this far inland on top of that, another one, there's 7 of these, and then the last one, there's 6 of them, and the last one, it's the same on every continent. So we have the same pattern worldwide. And Dr. Clary says, it takes a global cause to generate a global effect. Now, how does this tie into dinosaurs? Well, dinosaurs were rolled into one of these major rock packages, 1 or 2. And so it's worldwide, dinosaur burial. It's not just, it's not just one rock layer in Montana. Boy, it's all over the world. So what are we learning? Burial, catastrophic. Burial with living creatures, lookalikes. Burial in misery and burial widespread. And so these are all flood-friendly features of being buried, and even turning into a fossil at all. That doesn't happen today. And it reminds us of 2 Peter 3:6 that Peter got it right, saying the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. Now, if Peter got this right about the history of the world, a real flood, then you know what we should do with Peter? Pay attention. We should pay attention and listen. What else does Peter have to say? And that's what I started to do when I started to learn these flood-friendly features that my professors weren't telling me. And I thought, whoa, that's not in National Geographic TV shows. That's not, that's not in the movies or in my its textbooks. And yet it's real. And so widespread catastrophic burial all over the world, this really sets the flood apart as an event that really happened. So the second flood-friendly feature is blood. There's blood in them there bones. So that's what we're looking at now. And so I'll just get a few examples of blood remnants still inside and on top of, in some cases, some of these fossil bones. Not common. We don't think it's common, but we haven't looked very much. So these authors were studying this fossil, and it's a fossil, you want to say it after me? Mosasaur? Yeah, so it's an extinct marine reptile. Swam like a shark and covered with scales, had nostrils, so it had to surface to get air. But this one was about 20 feet long, really good specimen. Skin scales sucked down onto its bones like a mummy, like an Egyptian mummy, where your skin just sort of wraps around your bones, all the flesh on the inside rots or goes away. So it's like a natural mummy, a naturally mummified sea creature. There. And by the way, it was found in the middle of Kansas in the Niobrara chalks, where we have done a few digs ourselves looking at fossil fish. So this was excavated in 1967 and then put on display, because it's so pretty, at the LA County Natural History Museum. Well, some scientists were looking at it there. A Mosasaur expert from Belgium, Johan Lindgren, and he was looking at it and he said, well, why is there a red patch right there in its chest? And then he looked at the red patch, compared it with the positioning of the heart in long and slender aquatic creatures like dolphins. And he said, that's exactly where the heart is in a dolphin. It makes sense that it would be positioned there. But is it really the heart? So he looked for a magnet. Maybe there's a magnet buried underneath it that attracted iron atoms to that area. Maybe that's what colored it, stained it red, right where its heart would have been. Didn't find any magnets, but he did find hemoglobin. Well, that's blood protein. But protein doesn't last that long. We got protein decay rates, and we can measure how long we can form very rigorous and reasonable expectations about how long proteins can last, and it falls in at fewer than 1 million years. But nevertheless, he wrote this in the journal PLOS One: the traces may represent visceral organ residues. And then he also mentioned hemoglobin decay products in the same paper, published in 2010, paper called PLOS One. It's a free journal if you want to go look at it online. If you want to nerd out like me. Yeah. So when I saw it on display in LA some years ago, I had to get my picture taken with me pointing at the red patch. That's a bloody old smush squash, still colored red heart from the blood that was there, and it's on display. And again, I was jumping up and down with glee, and again, people were just backing away from me, and I don't understand why. Why aren't they so excited? Other authors found blood vessels this is a Tenontosaurus, which is a Triassic reptile, probably aquatic or semi-aquatic. Boy, these rock layers are they're below those that have most of the dinosaurs in them. So buried quite deeply, but they still have blood. Well, there's a blood vessel with a branch on it, and then there's two little red spheres inside, not outside, but inside that blood vessel. And so they said, these authors publishing in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, 2007, the presence of soft vessels, this is blood vessels, guys. Do you hear me what I'm saying? You guys aren't jumping up for joy and glee like I would expect you to be. Maybe it's internal. Maybe people from Illinois, they hold it in really well. They are neither biomineralized nor, in other words, they're not minerals, they're blood vessels. They don't have any inherent characteristics that would favor preservation. It's like, these should have rotted away a long time ago, so the presence of them being in this Tenontosaurus is enigmatic. A word that means? That's what it means. I don't know what's doing there. So I'm curious about this, and I want to learn more about it. How long can these things last? How long can blood last? How long can we expect it to last? Here's some more images of blood. This one published in the journal Science, 2009. Blood vessels with little red spheres inside them, again, not outside. And the journal study authors called them erythrocyte-like elements. So erythrocytes are a fancy word for blood cells. Why are they still colored red? They found hemoglobin. They sequenced hemoglobin and collagen, actually. And this is from Brachylophosaurus, excavated in Canada. So there's blood in them, their bones. So what's it doing there? And so this is you guys are the first people to see this. This is an image that a friend of mine has just captured of Edmontosaurus, if you want to say it. Okay, so that's a duck-billed dinosaur. I have you say these things because there's a 10-year-old inside every one of us that wants to say the dinosaur names, except for the people in the back who aren't saying anything. You're older than 10. Fine, be that way. Okay, anyway, this is you take a bone, you section it, and then you polish it, and you thin section it, and then you put it under a microscope, shine light through it, and this is the kind of image that you can get with a light microscope. And then we see, what are these spider-looking things? Those are osteocytes. Those are bone cells. And so this is what you see inside of a bone, really old bone. But then there's a space where a blood vessel might have been. And then we see these sphere-like structures that are still colored red. So we're curious as to what those are. Maybe these are what's left from old red blood cells. Is it organic? We don't know yet, but we're going to try to find ways to find out. And there's more. Here's from the same sample, different place, zoomed out a little bit. Lots of red spheres in the Edmontosaurus there. So ongoing area of research, but our evolutionary colleagues have already done the heavy lifting for us, telling us that they found hemoglobin, telling us that they don't know why it's still there. And so, so my conclusion is, if these things were deposited in the flood, then they were deposited thousands, not millions of years ago. By the way, that solves a big theological dilemma, doesn't it? Because now you have death of all these billions of creatures happening after sin, not before sin. But if they're billions of years old, millions of years old, then you have death, 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 dying, dying, death. And then God says, behold, it is all very good. I don't think so. I think the death happens after sin because of sin. And by placing these animal deaths, these fossils, in Noah's flood, historically, it explains the science of blood, and it explains how you can get death after sin, not before sin. Therefore, it explains why the gospel makes more sense to us, because what did Jesus do? He died, paid the death penalty on our behalf, because we need that. We need a Savior to do that for us, because we're the ones who earned the death penalty with our sin. And so He paid it for us. And so if we trust in Him, we can find new life in Him through that whole process spiritually. So Paul got it right in Romans 1:20, saying, for billions of years after the Big Bang beginning, His invisible attributes are clearly seen. Oh, wait, I misquoted it. No. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen. People must have been there to see it, or angels, or both. So angels and people able to see God's invisible attributes by looking at what God made. Since how long? Since the creation of the world. So if people were there at the beginning, well, that means Genesis is right about people being alive, Adam and Eve, right there during creation week. Clearly seen. And so the timing that the Bible suggests, and even strongly suggests, of when God created, when God flooded, 1,656 years after creation, according to the genealogies in Genesis 5. The timing that God says, it matches what we're starting to see in the fossils. The violence that God describes the flood with, all the high hills under the whole heavens, totally covered. Every creature that had the breath of life in its nostrils and walked on land and had legs, those creatures died. Fish, well, a lot of them died too. Mosasaurs died too in the flood. Some of them may have survived. All the fish we have in today's oceans and lakes survived the flood some way or another and have populated today's waters. Okay, feature number 3, flood-friendly. You know what? I could add another fantastically flood-friendly fossil feature. Number 3 is B-Rex. This is the nickname given to this dinosaur here. Named after the discoverer, Bob Harmon, who found a bone sticking out of a hillside in Montana. And here I am again at the museum just going, this is it. This is the head that's associated with the leg bone from which they found this squishy connective tissue. This is awesome. I got to take a picture of this. Wow, look everybody. And all these strangers kept backing away. What is the problem with all these people? So when I saw these images published in the journal Science in 2005 of still red, bloody red material, I mean, this is good enough for a Chicago hot dog. Look at that. I'm starting to feel hungry again. Connective tissue is still red. They found hemoglobin, and they found chemical signatures of hemoglobin and collagen. So collagen, what's that? Collagen is what makes up your skin. Collagen is in your bone. It's all throughout your bones. It's a strong, ropey protein at the molecular level. Strong because it's actually 3 strands wrapped around one another, just like some of the twine that we have. Because a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. Anyway, that's in your bones, so that's collagen protein. It lasts a long time, especially when it's locked inside minerals, because bone is a mixture of protein, ropey protein, with minerals packed around, mineral crystals packed around, hydroxyapatite packed around those. So that's what makes your bones so strong and yet so lightweight. Flexible and yet stiff. So bones are ingeniously engineered and designed by a creator to do exactly what they need to do, support creatures' body weight. Well, when Dr. Mary Schweitzer, who published this paper, she was the lead author on it, when she dissolved away the mineral part of the bone, as you'll hear her say in a second, this is the kind of material that she left behind. When I saw these pictures, I thought to myself, what is going on here? Now, this is something my professors never told me, and I bet if they knew it, they would suppress it, because Romans chapter 1, we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. What's the truth? The truth is, burial was vast and it was catastrophic. What's the truth? There's blood in them, their bones. These are truths. These are flood-friendly truths, though. That's the problem, isn't it? Because if the flood is right, then the Bible is right. And if the Bible is right about the flood in history, then it's right about what it says about my sick heart. It's personal. So there's a spiritual reason why some of these secular colleagues of mine refuse, willfully ignorant, of creation and the flood, just like 2 Peter 3 says. There's a spiritual background to that. So that's where we're headed, looking at these bloody B-Rex. So that reminds us of collagen in the B-Rex femur, but we also see it in this beautiful fossil published in Current Biology. Skin, with the pigment still inside the skin. You know what pigment is? It's what makes skin or hair dark. The more pigment you have, the darker your hair or skin. So animals also have and had pigment. And so so they published this, and they said, based on our findings, and they're using black light so that's why it looks purplish on the matrix. In other words, this part has purplish, see it? That's the stone, and so but the black light shows up the pigment, the skin, which is a different material. You know, when I was a kid, I went to a dinosaur museum. My first exposure to dinosaurs, pretty freaky actually, because they had a T-Rex right there at the front door, and right at kid level, you know, with these big teeth. And I said, "Mom, what's that?" And she said, "Well, let's ask the museum lady." So we went and asked the museum lady. "My son has a question for you." "What is that?" You know, well, that is a dinosaur fossil. I'm 7 years old. I don't know what a fossil is. What's a fossil? And she said, a fossil is a rock in the shape of the bone. All the original bone is gone, gone, gone. You know what our prior administration would have said about that? Fake news. Fake news. It's not all gone. It's still there. The skin is still there on this Chinese fossil. Protoceratops, I think. Well, the collagen decay regime is well characterized. We have several different secular papers that have given us an activation energy of activation for chemists. So in other words, we know the kinetics, so we know the decay rate of this tough, long-lasting molecule. And so here's an example of an experimental result showing day 1, day 2, day 3, after several days at high temperature to simulate time, to accelerate time, so that we can do this decay experiment within a human lifetime, because it decays so slowly. We can use the Arrhenius equation to get the decay rate at other temperatures. So we plug in a different temperature. We do the experiment at high temperatures, and then we plug in whatever temperature we want. And that's how we know how fast this stuff decays and how long we expect it to last. Here's just an example of a... Okay, so what you're seeing is a curving downward slope, right? Okay, what does that represent? You got a lot of pristine collagen at the beginning of your experiment, but then you expose your bones to heat, measure the collagen after a few days, measure the collagen's integrity, how much of it is left after several days, and after a dozen days, it's all gone in that experiment. We've tried to replicate that, okay? So here's a different journal that did a similar result, and I'll just give you if you don't like graphs and you do like words, here's a different way to express the same idea. Extrapolation from high temperature experimental decomposition rates. This is lab bench science. We can observe it, we can repeat it. Suggests that at a constant 10 degrees Celsius, it'll take between 200,000 and 700,000 years at that temperature for collagen to basically disappear. So this is like a maximum, best case scenario, ideal conditions, shelf life. Max shelf life, fewer than 1 million years. And yet we're finding it in dinosaur and other fossil bones with age assignments of tens of millions, and in some cases, more than that.
What happened next happened by mistake. Mary put some fragments of the bone in acid to dissolve away the outermost layer of mineral. But the acid worked too fast, and all the mineral dissolved away. Being a fossil, there should have been nothing left. But there was, and it was elastic, like living tissue.
This is the piece.
No. She showed us video she took under the microscope.
That's really what happened?
Yes.
That's the dinosaur bone?
Without mineral now. That's what was left.
It looked like the soft tissue she would have expected to find if it had been modern bone. This was impossible. This bone was 68 million years old.
So you see this, and you think, what? You
I
see,
didn't want to tell anybody.
you'd be ridiculed,
Yes.
right?
And so I said to my technician, okay, do it again. I don't believe it.
And yet, in sample after sample, they were there. Things that looked suspiciously like flexible, transparent blood vessels. She finally mustered the courage to tell Jack.
And there's Jack Horner, who retired recently. Do you see the dilemma? And so this is a 60 minutes program. The title of the program is B-Rex, if you want to find yourself a copy of it. You can see the rest of it. So that was describing what she and her team found from that particular fossil, B-Rex. Stretchy, flexible material that shouldn't last as long as they're saying it did. And so, well, there's a few explanations that she has actually, one explanation she has offered and another explanation that gained some traction. Right when this came out in 2005, scientists said, no way that could be from a T-Rex. You must have dropped your lunch in a test tube. No, you chuckle. But a buddy of mine went to the Smithsonian in about 2010, and he and I'd been talking to him about all these discoveries in 05 and 09 with these blood vessels and everything. And he went to the paleontology exhibit at the Smithsonian, and he found the curator of the exhibit, and he said, Sir, you're the curator, you're the paleontologist. Have you heard about the soft tissue in dinosaur bones? Yes, I have heard about that. Some won't even admit that they have, or that they actually haven't. More stories on that maybe later. But he said, I have. He said, well, how do you explain it? My buddy said, how do you explain it? Well, I do have a theory on that because it can't be from the actual dinosaur. So he said, I think the workers were out in the field and they took a lunch break. And they and accidentally, some of their lunch fell into the packaging that when they were wrapping up these dinosaurs. And so when they got to the lab, they actually found blood vessels from their bologna. I think it is a bologna. Bunch of bologna. So that's one theory. So we're grasping at straws to explain these things, and it's not just from one T-Rex, okay? And I'll show you a list of 100 papers that we found in the secular literature that describe biological materials still in fossils from all over the globe, found throughout all the layers, most of the layers of the geologic column. And so the next one came out and said maybe bacteria did it. Maybe it's just bacterial slime, this bacteria manufacturing ooze, they call it biofilm, down inside these bones. And maybe that's what they're finding. The problem with that is that bacteria, there's lots of problems with that, bacteria don't make hollow branching tubes. That's blood vessels. Bacteria don't make collagen protein. They don't have the tools to manufacture that particular kind of protein. So when these secular scientists, for example, publishing in 2017, Journal of Proteome Research, the sequence, collagen sequence from Brachylophosaurus canadensis. And with these little blue letter P's, those are indicating hydroxyproline, which is a hydroxylated amino acid that bacteria cannot manufacture. So anyway, these are what they smell like, they are what they taste like, they are what they look like, and they are what they chemistry like. They're blood vessels. Not just that, but bone cells, and it's not just T-Rexes. This is taken from a turtle shell, published 2012. And so we've been curating a list for many, I guess, since 2013 now. And so here's our list. It's free, it's online, and it's a list of original biomaterial fossil papers. And at the time I captured this image, it was 2017, and we had 89. Well, now it's 2021, and we have 116 papers that have been published in secular journals that describe, you name it, collagen, elastin, laminin, DNA, pigments, all kinds of different biochemicals. Remnants of them, they're not pristine, but there's enough of them there to identify chemically. And so those are all the journal references. You can look at it online. It goes page after page of these things. Okay? And now the one I published and added to the list, just going to throw this anecdote in, was published in the journal Expert Review of Proteomics. And I got to tell you, it was hard to get this published. So mine was a review paper. So basically, I took that long list and I said, here's a summary of all these different papers, summarizing it all in one journal article here. And it took a long time to get reviewed. So the way science works, publishing world, is you send your manuscript into the journal, and then they take your manuscript, erase your name from it so that there's no bias, and they distribute your manuscript to a couple of different experts in your field so they can scour it without knowing who you are, because if they don't like you, they'll really scour it if they know who you are. So they just scour it and make sure that it doesn't have any science errors. And so we got one reviewer comments. We don't know who the reviewers are because they don't tell us that when we write a paper. One reviewer said, "This looks great. You should also talk about some plant fossils." And he gave us references that we didn't even have to fossilized plants with chlorophyll and wax and plant, still the leaf tissue still inside the rock there. And then another reviewer said, "What you're saying is insane." And he used adjectives like preposterous to suggest that these things could last this long. You don't know anything about decay rates. So the review that we got back in trying to publish this paper represented a microcosm of the world of paleontology that's trying to wrestle with this enigma. How can it still be there? It can't last that long. And so we weren't able in this paper to say, young Earth creationism solved the problem. We'd never get published. So what we did say was, it's an enigma. Okay? So we don't have any sciencey answers for you. But if you read the paper, you'll come up with, and if you have any idea about the flood, you'll come up with the conclusion that, hey, these fossils, soft tissues discovered all over the world, sort of maps a few of them out for us. They all look young. And look, if it was recently deposited in the US, South America, recently deposited in Africa, Spain, UK, Poland, China, recently deposited all over the world, well, maybe there's a recent worldwide depositional event that can explain this recent worldwide deposit. And so we call that Noah's flood. And it was recorded and curated for us, edited for us by Moses. He was responsible for the text of Genesis. And he says, Jesus says this to the Pharisees. Hey guys, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? My words, that you can come to me and find salvation for your souls, everlasting life in me. Those are my words. So we live in a culture today that's persuaded and convinced that you should not believe Moses' writings. The flood, garbage. Genesis, junk. So no wonder when we share the good news of what Jesus can do, people say, well, that comes from the Bible, right? Well, that's written by a bunch of monks, who doctored it up, and it's all myths. Myths by monks. Well, no wonder. So we have a lot of work to do. We need to equip ourselves to have better conversations with our friends and family members and neighbors with reasons that maybe they haven't heard. Have you heard about the soft tissues? Have you heard about the widespread burial? Have you heard about the violent burial? Have you heard? Have you heard? Have you heard? And if you're not confident in being able to ask good questions, get the books. We brought a few books for you to do to get acquainted. So these flood-friendly features fortify our faith. Hey, in Noah's flood. Burial widespread and catastrophically, blood in them, their bones, and then B-Rex with the collagen that can't last that long. Well, what do we have here? So I just brought a few books, and you'll see them in the back. We did not bring this book, but hey, we could sell it to you online, I guess. If you go to store.icr.org, you can download any of our books onto your digital reader thingy. So there's that. But we did bring this one, Creation Basics and Beyond. I think we have it for $10 today. And it answers not just questions about dinosaurs and biomaterials that are still inside the bones. It answers all kinds of questions that so many people have when they start thinking about Genesis in terms of, could this really have happened? Did creation really work? Was there really an ice age? Answered in this book. How do you get an ice age? Boom. How does carbon dating work? What about radioisotope dating, other kinds of radioisotope dating? How does it work? When did it happen? When were these rocks deposited? We talk about dinosaurs, we talk about the gap theory. Say, well, what if there's a gap of time in between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 2? So we address each of these questions in Creation Basics and Beyond, co-authored by my colleagues at the Institute. And you can get the digital one at store.icr.org. Oh, I've got a promo code. So anything you want to buy, if you would type that promo code in our online checkout process, you get, I think it's 20% off, some kind of percentage. It depends on the resource. Finally, and most importantly, we have a free magazine called Acts and Facts. And that's what the sign-up sheet looks like. You can get it digitally if you give us your email. You can get it physically if you give it your address. Or you can get it both if you fill out that information for us. All to do what? To equip us to be able to ask better questions so that we can point people back to the historicity of Genesis and therefore trusting not just the Bible, but the God of the Bible who wrote it. Science backs it up, and we ought to tell the world. Thanks.